This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome back. Good to have my friend Eric Peters on the show. It's a Tuesday and that's kind of our tradition. Eric, how's life in the frozen, I was going to say the frozen north, but Virginia's really in the south. So how are things in the frozen south these days?
Yeah, exactly. I'm sending up some hosannas and thankful prayers to the gods of the hydrocarbons for keeping us warm.
You guys have really had a blast of some super cold air. How long is this expected to last?
Looks like indefinitely into next week. And tonight it's apparently going to get down into the single digits. And I'm so very, very glad that I don't have an EV to drive this week so that I don't have to, pay attention to that range monitor and then turn down the heat and make it home, hopefully.
Gads, that would certainly add to the difficulty level. Speaking of EVs, I saw your article on bricking Teslas, and the title alone kind of grabbed me. When we talk about bricking a Tesla, what does that mean?
Well, okay, it's a two-parter. The first is there is news percolating upward about how Teslas that have the so-called full self-drive feature, the automated driving, are having some kind of a computer glitch that causes them to brick, meaning they go inert and they can't be driven. And that's interesting in and of itself, but I think far more interesting is the fact that when Teslas work, they can be bricked because they're connected, because Tesla controls your car. You don't. Now, I like to whack the Tesla piñata, but it's not just them. It's all of the connected cars that are made by practically everybody. And I think it's very important that people come to understand that even though it's their name on the paperwork and the title and they're making monthly payments, in a very real sense, they don't own their car because ultimately they don't control it.
And this is a trend that's not just limited to EVs. I was reading where farmers with John Deere tractors are finding themselves essentially unable to work on their own tractors, or their tractors shutting down. They're very computerized, but essentially it's the same thing you're talking about. They may be making the payment, they may hold the title, but they don't really own it because it's connected. It's controlled from elsewhere.
That's right. Something that I thought was interesting that's related to this, the guy that supposedly drove the Cybertruck up to Trump's hotel in Vegas and blew it up. It was very interesting to me that within a couple of hours of that happening, the news media and law enforcement had a full read of where this guy had been, his entire course, starting from point A to ending at point B in front of the hotel. And again, that shows that you're being monitored in real time, constantly, and that your car is being tracked, which means you're being tracked. They know where you are. And even more than that, they actually probably know what you're saying and even what you're looking like, because all new cars have microphones and cameras built into the interior, if you can believe it. And that's another thing that I'm trying hard to spread the word about.
I know I read a couple of comments about the way this guy's route was tracked, and someone had made the comment, geez, he had to stop 8 times to recharge along the way. The tongue-in-cheek comment, I'd have killed myself too if I had to stop that often.
Yeah, that's very well said. Yeah, I mean, getting back to that whole charge thing, which is a whole other can of worms. That Honda EV that I had, I tried to warm up the windshield because it was cold and covered with ice, and I lost about 20 miles of range over the course of about 15 or 20 minutes of trying to defrost the windshield, and that brought it down to like 80 miles, of range. And as we talked about before, the range that's indicated on the dash is usually very optimistic, by, again, a factor of about 20%. And even worse if you use the heater and you use the windshield defroster, all of which are electrically powered. So, it's this constant dance of trying to figure out how far can I go, how long have I got to wait. And in the cold like this, I ended up not driving it because I thought to myself, it's 13 degrees. And if I get stuck somewhere, what am I going to do? I mean, literally, it's potentially dangerous to get stuck somewhere when it's 13 degrees out and you're not dressed like an Eskimo, right?
No, it's scary. We've talked before about, my anxiety when I was driving a CNG car, and it was totally CNG, and making sure I could get to the next station and knowing I had very limited range. And man, when you coast into town on fumes and you're not sure if you're going to be able to make it, I mean, that's time you start making an ulcer for yourself. I can only imagine what the EV drivers are feeling now in the cold weather as they watch that charge just slowly recede, even if it's just sitting there.
Sure. And there's another compounding factor. I thought to myself, well, 80 miles is probably enough for me to make it downtown to where there's a fast charger. The problem is the fast charger might not be working. That's happened to me a number of times where it's just, unavailable for some reason or another. And that happens to other people. If you, follow this stuff across the country, people will report, well, I went to the fast charger, but it wasn't working. Or there was somebody there ahead of me or something like that. So now you're really screwed because you're waiting and hoping that you were going to get charged, but you can't. And now you don't have enough charge to go anywhere else. So it's no wonder, at least in my area, that we're not seeing very many EVs out on the road when it's as cold as this.
A good point. And, again, not to bag on anybody who loves their EV, but for people who are thinking about getting one, this is something you might want to consider. I know when you go to rent a car, oftentimes, hey, would you like to have an EV? And my friends
and I actually beg you, don't they?
Oh, kind of. And my friends and I have very enthusiastic, hell no, we don't want one.
Yeah, right. Okay, and that's, again, compounding problems. You're in an unfamiliar place. You've flown to another city. You don't really know your way around probably. And, you probably have business to do, or, you're wanting to visit your family or friends or whatever you're there for. The last thing you want to do is hunt around to try to find a fast charger and then sit there at one. And by the way, oh my gosh, I got to get to the airport because my flight leaves in 2 hours and I have to be there an hour ahead of time. I got to stop and wait at a fast charger that may or may not be working. And if I don't charge the thing up, I'm going to get exorbitantly charged by the rental car place for the charge that I didn't put back into the EV.
Very true. Very true. Hey, speaking of exorbitant charges, I want to shift gears here and talk about congestion relief zones. I saw some footage and some photographs out of New York City that were during the workday. This is like, when you would expect to see the streets very crowded, and it looked like a ghost town. And they said that this was because of the congestion relief zones that the city is enacting. Tell me about what those zones are and what are they trying to accomplish?
Well, let's start with the verbiage. As is pretty much always true when it comes to government, they try to mind diddle you by using terminology that makes it sound like they're helping you and they're doing something positive when it's exactly the opposite of that. They're not relieving congestion. What they're doing is mulcting drivers. They're requiring people who drive into the city to work to pay $9 each trip, if you can imagine that, and how quickly that's going to end up. It comes out to about $2,000 a year for the great privilege of being allowed to drive your private car into the city to go to work, which of course a lot of people have to do because New York is so expensive that unless you're very, very affluent, it's almost impossible to live in the city. So there are people who work outside the city to come in, and now they're being charged. And by the way, they're being charged twice because all these roads are paid for by motor fuels vehicle taxes, right? Which we all pay. So now people are being made to pay again. And it's all part of this attempt to make driving miserable and unaffordable, with the end goal being to push as many people as possible out of cars and into some form of government-controlled transportation like a bus or a train.
And I'm guessing that doesn't include parking, which they also would have to pay for.
Oh, yeah. And, ordinarily, if this were restricted to just a big major metropolitan area like New York City, you could say, well, thank God I don't live there. But this is something that they are going to try to implement everywhere. This is part of their plan. If you look into the urban planning documents, this is one of the tools in their kit box, kind of like road diets, which you've probably heard of, and bike lanes and so on, to winnow down the available road space for cars so as to make driving more difficult and more expensive. They do this in Europe, where it's extremely expensive to drive a car into Paris, for example, and some other cities by mulcting you. And they also require you to have a transponder fitted to your car. They call it Easy Pass. Again, note the verbiage. They make it sound all friendly and kumbaya. Yeah, it's easy, all right, for them to filch your wallet, isn't it? And to take your money. That's what it's all about.
I'm just trying to think of a similar kind of name that we could give for those ankle monitors they put on prisoners who are, house release or whatever. I'm sure they could come up with something similar.
Yeah, I'm going to have to something along the lines of a Fitbit, I think, I'll come up with something.
Well, this is one of the things I appreciate about you, Eric, is you do pay attention to words and what they mean. And you're right. More often than not, whatever the government is telling us, the name of the official act is this. And typically, in Orwellian fashion, it means the exact opposite.
Yeah, very good example of that being the Patriot Act, implying that somehow you're not patriotic if you don't believe in a police state. and and having people frisked like they're incoming felons being processed at the jail in order to board a commercial airplane.
Yep, there's just no end to the ways that government messes with us. And I love the example you gave here in the congestion relief zones of, when a robber robs you, it's give me your money. When the government does it, the city needs revenue.
Yes. Yeah. And it's very deliberately done. And I have to give them credit. It's genius. They phrase it in such a way to kind of unconsciously and reflexively prevent people from really understanding or thinking about what it is that's happening to them. And in a way also shaming them if they raise questions or object to it. Notice how the way they bandy about that term anti-Semitism, to go on another tangent. So if you criticize the policies of the government of Israel, let's say, including really abhorrent things that are objectively awful, somehow that makes you anti-Jewish. That makes you, somebody who wants to kill people, as opposed to, hey, I'm not really cool with mass murder.
Right. Well, and this is where you number one have to be somewhat informed and willing to think independently, but you also have to have pretty thick skin, because once those labels start coming out, a lot of people run for cover. They don't want to be racist or anti-Semite.
It's true. Now, I do what I can to try to encourage people to really think about the words that we use, because they are important. I think we've become a less thoughtful society because we often don't think about the words that we're using and the meanings of those words, which is a really subtle mechanism for controlling the way people think. And I think if we're more judicious and conscious of the language that we use and what exactly it is that we're talking about, we'll become a more thoughtful and then a more civilized country again.
Hear, hear. Want to get your thought on the fires in Los Angeles. And, I'm not in any way trying to make light of people's misfortune, but boy, a lot of the elite seem to have been cleaned out. I think Mel Gibson had a good quote. His house burned while he was doing his interview with Joe Rogan. And his take was, I've been relieved of the burden of my stuff.
Yeah, sure. Of course, Gibson is a multi-millionaire, and for him, it's more of an inconvenience than a tragedy. People who are in that bracket don't necessarily have to deal with the same problems that a person who's literally been ruined and has nothing at all, including no place to live. Mel Gibson has no problem finding another place to live. He can check into $1,000 a night suite if he wants to. So it's really, it is a tragic thing, and it's absolutely despicable in my mind. The way basic infrastructure apparently wasn't working. Can you imagine fire hydrants that don't have water? How does that even happen in an American city? Are we Zimbabwe? And the answer is absolutely, we are. Well,
and the water that could have been diverted to those reservoirs instead was used to save some fish that was believed to be endangered. And it's just, this seemed like the perfect storm of left-wing politics, starting with, we put animal and plant life above human life and property. We have diversity, equity, and inclusion in the hiring. So there was 3 Karens, on duty there at the head of the fire department, none of which knew how to handle a disaster like this.
Sure, and I think to put a finer point on it, some human life. Again, I think the take-home point here is that the elites, as they like to think of themselves, people like Newsom, the mayor, the fire chief, these are all people who are insulated from the consequences of their actions. I got kicked off of X because I dared to point out that Keir Starmer, the prime minister over there, who suppressed information about horrific crimes, he doesn't have to worry about that. His family isn't going to be attacked because he lives in a safe, gated community of some kind under armed guard, and he's protected. And that's why these people are so insufferably arrogant. They visit these horrors on us, the lowing cattle, and they sort of indifferently stroll along, insulated in their bubble of protectedness and affluence.
Yeah, and it's kind of rich to see California Governor Gavin Newsom talking about, we're gonna undo all these regulations and red tape so that people can rebuild quickly. Oh, and we're also gonna cap prices and prevent price gouging. And it's like, does this man know anything about economics? How'd that red tape get there in the first place?
Well, sure. And, here's something else that popped into my mind that I think we're going to hear more about in the very near future. Can you imagine the losses that are being incurred, and specifically with regard to insurance and home insurance, and what the ripple effect of that's going to be on home insurance policies that are paid by people who don't even live in California, as these insurance conglomerates attempt to recoup the losses that they're going to feel. It's not going to be that they're going to raise the cost of the insurance policies of the people in California only. They're going to spread those costs over to the rest of the country.
Yep. And that's, I know, I think it was James Howard Kunstler had said, good luck insurance companies and the companies that insure the insurance companies. If the government steps in to bail you out, we're all going to feel that, because the only way they can do that is create more money out of thin air, dilute the buying power of our dollars further, and spike inflation a little bit more.
I think we're going to see an interesting thing develop. I think with regard to both home insurance and car insurance, I think in the near future, there is going to be massive non-compliance. People are just going to stop paying because they are going to face the prospect of either paying for this exorbitant insurance or paying for food, basic life necessities. It's going to get to the point where these things are simply no longer affordable, and there will be mass disobedience and mass refusal to pay. And what are they going to do about it then? And actually, I think that that's like a silver lining to this dark cloud.
No, I would agree. It's sad that people are going to have to feel pain before they get to the point where they realize, you know what, there's no way we're going to comply our way, out of tyranny.
No, and I think also, I'm speculating here, but this is just based upon past experience, that these insurance companies are going to do everything that they can to deny and diminish the claims of people who've lost their homes. And that is just going to generate another tsunami of righteous anger. And it's not going to end well for these people. The people hate the health insurance mafia. They hate the car insurance mafia. And they're soon going to hate the home insurance mafia, because they're just getting mulcted by these people. They want your money. But then when you file a claim, even after you've been paying for 20 or 30 years, all of a sudden, they're not going to pay. Right. And it's insufferable. And I think people are at the point of saying, enough, I'm not going to do it anymore.
Well, when we talk about this in the context of, the low congestion zones and the EVs and or congestion relief zones rather in the EVs, and trying to force people into basically not having their autonomy, this just makes me want to be more and more in the country, living my own life. I'm not turning my back on civilization, but I'm going to be very selective about how I choose to interface with civilization moving forward.
I would actually rephrase that. I think you're recovering civilization. That's where civilization is, where reality is, where real people are and real human interactions are, as opposed to this alienating interaction that we have with these totally, in many cases, automated AI, centrally controlled systems. Think about what happens when you call the customer service line for some, major corporation's credit card or anything else, your health insurance. You almost never get a person. You have to go through this awful phone tree. As opposed to when you live in a rural area, I'm friends with the guy who runs the literal country store down the road. I know him. He knows me. I go in there and we talk and I buy some things, and it's a human kind of interaction that you don't have in these gigantic, sprawling, corporate-controlled megalopolises.
I could agree with that. And so, yes, I will preserve civilization by getting to know my neighbors and working to help them and bartering with them. And yeah, sure, I may miss out on my Presidential Medal of Freedom, but hey, it's a small price to pay.
It's a good price to pay. Another thing I recommend, and I think you and I have talked about this, to the extent that you're able, acquire physical hard copies of valuable books, because, everything digitized is not only subject to being taken away, it's subject to being rewritten. They're doing this odious process now of changing long, thinkful, classic books. And a point will come probably when they'll no longer be available. So I think it's up to us to preserve the intellectual legacy of the West. And that's one way we can do it.
Hear, hear. By the way, just so we can kind of end on a positive note, my understanding is there was a big win for Amish farmer Amos Miller in Pennsylvania, and correspondingly kind of a big win for food freedom, in that apparently a lawsuit by the state of Pennsylvania has been moving through the courts, and it sounds like Amos can continue to make his food available to customers outside of his state. I mean, this is the reason the Amish turned out in record numbers to vote for Trump in the 2024 election. And glad to see there's a little bit of a ripple effect there. Hopefully that'll catch on in other states that are similarly struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. There is something so mind-haltingly effronterous about the idea that you're not allowed to buy raw milk from the Amish farmer that's over there. Well, why? I mean, who are you to tell me that I can't buy milk or meat or whatever from anybody that I want to. Why is that any of the government's business in a free society? And that last part should be emphasized very, very much, because we don't live in a free society. And I think that people are beginning to understand that. Something so basic as being able to buy milk is something that's a criminal act, and they send the hut crew to the Amish farmer's place, and they drag the guy away in manacles for selling milk.
And that's, you nailed it. You know, in a free society, you don't have people coming in pointing guns to take away things that we said you can't have. Especially, you know, when it's my choice. I want raw milk, or I want, you know, the cheese that he makes, or whatever. Well,
and it's very important to point out in this case, which I think central to the lawsuit, there was no harm caused to anybody. It was a purely technical, legal thing that they brought against this man. Nobody said, "Oh, I had some of his milk and it made me sick. It made my child go to the hospital." Not one person even made an allegation about anything like that. It was simply that the state said, "Thou shalt not sell your milk." That's the so-called crime.
And he could have obtained forgiveness of a sorts by simply bending the knee, paying the money for the state's permission, and, you know, receiving its compliance stickers or whatever.
Yep.
But again, there was no harm being done, so there really wasn't a need for all that compliance enforcement in the first place, was there?
Yes. I think if we're going to recover America, we must recover our moral sense. Instead of this blind obedience to something because it's the law. I think anytime you encounter a law, it's appropriate, it's rational to ask, well, is this something that is right, morally speaking, or is it something that's wrong? And if it isn't wrong morally, you're under no compulsion to obey it.
Hear, hear. Again, we're talking with Eric Peters from ericpetersautos.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Eric, great to catch up with you once again. Stay warm, my friend.
You too, Brian. Thank you very much.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.